great. Well, it's really fitting to follow up the conversation with Dr. Kendi on building an anti-racist recovery with an amazing leader who's been working to advance social justice and economic justice for a very long time. My name is Michael Collins. I'm Vice President at JFF, and I couldn't be more excited to have a conversation about corporate commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Where are we now, and where do we need to go? With Dalila Wilson-Scott. Dalila is Executive Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at Comcast Corporation and President of the Comcast NBC Universal Foundation. Dalila, thank you so much for being here.
It's an honor to be here, Michael. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. So, Dalila, you oversee diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives for the corporation, and you also lead giving and philanthropic strategy, including the $100 million commitment to advance social justice and equality. And you've spent 16 years at JP Chase as head of global philanthropy and president of the JP Chase Foundation. You've been at the forefront of the fight for social and economic justice. You've been working in the vineyards for a very long time, and now it appears that corporate America and the U.S. and perhaps the world is paying more attention to these issues. And so I just thought I'd start out by just checking in with you. How are you experiencing this moment?
It's interesting. I think we all know this moment is different, but we also know that difference can be a moment or it can change the trajectory that we were on. And I do believe we are here. I think those of us who have chosen this field, we've always believed this, but lots of things need to align. So, what I would say is what's different about this specific moment. I think what we saw for the first time is a global awareness and recognition and acceptance even of some of the systemic racism that many of us have been talking about for decades. I think there's much more ability for people to understand that this is a much deeper issue. And there were many more people stepping up as allies. And I think that's important. I also think that people are being much more critical, quite frankly, of what we know and what we don't know about our history. Even in the coverage of the 100th anniversary of Black Wall Street this year, and just the different type of voice and recognition of, what if I had known about Black Wall Street and Tulsa and, the entrepreneurs, the community, all of that we're seeking for all of us, that economic prosperity, that just, wanting to be there for each other, that was possible 100 years ago. I think many of us would not have thought it was possible. What we know is, and I'm speaking in the U.S. perspective here, is we know a lot about sort of the history that we don't celebrate, and slavery and what that meant and what it's like to be Black in America today. But I think there's a willingness and an openness and a readiness for us to understand our history better and to understand how that'll change going forward. So I'm experiencing it with a little bit of excitement, cautious optimism, and just drive to make sure that this moment is different than the many moments all of us have seen before, witnessed before.
Absolutely. I want to come back to the moment in a minute, but I'm just curious, for me, the personal is professional, and I've found that, while I need to focus on the issues with objectivity and rigor, I, like many leaders of color, am also living through this moment, and I'm just wondering, how do you strike that balance? What do you think about that balance?
I reread your Medium post this week. I knew we were getting together, and you did it much more eloquently than I ever could, but it's an interesting dynamic, right? Both of us have been successful in our careers. We've been able to do a lot of great work at scale, quite frankly, when it comes to economic justice and how we think about social impact work, obviously the work we're helping to fund for JFF. But at the end of the day, it does boil down to, I have two sons. I have three children, two sons, one daughter. And in that posting where you noted when your son asked you when would he become that threat, that's probably been accepted for me and you for quite some time. It's interesting when you hear something from your own child that limits their capability, right? As parents, we always want the best for our child. We always want them never to experience the hardship we had. And yet we know, and the data supports it, that even with our success, even as much access we have, even as many resources we have available to us, our kids, statistics will say, will do no better than many others. And I think that is a harsh reality. And while, there are many people who are struggling in many ways that I am no longer struggling in my life right now, it's a harsh reality when you're doing this work. And it's something that keeps us moving forward, but it's also something that, how long has this been the reality? And it definitely can make, it makes some of the days tougher. But it also, kind of inspires us to press forward for sure. But I think that recognition, I think you just spoke to it very well, personally and professionally, what that means.
Well, I really appreciate that, and you're very gracious. I know that kind of this kind of dual reality of kind of living and working, gives us a different perspective when we're having conversations, at the corporate level, and when we are trying to kind of explain kind of some of the experiences and some of the environment that we need to make change. I know that you've had conversations at the highest levels, like in corporate America. You've had to bring your leadership along, the boards along. How are you having those conversations? They're difficult conversations. I know that you are skilled at this. You've been having this a long time. How are you translating kind of this moment and in some of the conversations that you're having with leadership there?
Well, one of the tenets of sort of workforce design and development and evolution is, we've been living in this belief, which is somewhat of a myth, where you go down a specific path, you're trained, you're educated, and then you sort of move along in your career. Well, the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation, the same conversation I had today, I would use different language than I would just 5 years ago. So one, kind of back to what's different for corporations, just the acknowledgement and the usage of race in describing some of the issues. That's much more prevalent today than ever before, where I think people were comfortable talking about economically disadvantaged, underrepresented, name your term, but not necessarily making it about race. There's the conversation people are having about, people will generally say people of color. Some people use that term as a term of comfort when they really want to say this is about Black people. At the same time, some people are using people of color to use a broader set of individuals, but not everybody feels like that term is theirs or represents them or one they would use. So one, I think it's positive that people are talking about race and that it's not just those of us who are sitting in roles of CDO and social impact leaders that are doing that. So I think that's important. I think also, especially kind of in the past year, we've seen a record number of appointments, elevations to boards, people making different business decisions on top of hiring decisions. Those changes will definitely spur other changes. And I think that's important. There's something about having this conversation and being in a true diverse set of individuals and executives versus defending a lot of people who don't happen to be in that room with you. That's a different conversation when you're feeling like a sole voice or an only voice. I think it's also helpful that more people are raising their hand to say, I don't quite understand that. We have a speaker series here that was kicking off actually right before COVID, and we expanded it since then. In fact, Dr. Kennedy was one of our very first guests. And just the notion of anti-racism, right? More people today know what that is than they did, a year ago. But just what is anti-racism? No one will say, I'm a racist. Most people will not say I'm a racist. But there's so much to being anti-racist that people didn't understand before. They didn't have tools, to understand kind of bias and accept that. So I think being able to use language that wasn't common before is important. Seeing the progression that is being made, but it's really about the long-term momentum. So I do think this is a transformation in how people are having the conversation and a comfort level with some of the progress. But it is being skilled at it 5 years ago, I'm still learning how to adapt in the moment, quite frankly.
Well, I really appreciate that, and you've been a leader in this space for such a long time. So it's interesting to hear you saying that you have to adapt. I think that you do this work so well. One question I have is that you're clearly an optimist, right? Like you think that change has happened. What is your conversation like with some of your peers that really believe that this moment is performative? The corporate commitments are largely performative. How do you shared a lot that suggests that you really believe things are changing. How do you talk to the people who don't believe that?
I think a couple of things. When for this moment, when I say I do think things are on the right path, and that I do absolutely anticipate some positive momentum for that, I should be clear that the awareness level is up. There's definitely increased activity, but you really have to, in this moment, change that conversation to one about very specific targeted outcomes. And I think that's important. So what we have is people feeling the need to do something in the urgency of the moment. And not all of those things are bad, but I want to be clear, not all of those things are going to get us to these outcomes. Yeah. So I think there has to be that recognition of that. And what I would tell anybody is, and I have believed that I kind of have to be an optimist to do this work, because it would be really hard, quite frankly, to get up every day if I don't think my work is going to ultimately drive positive outcomes. I have to believe that. And if you can believe it, you're going to think differently about how to get there. When you hit a wall, and trust me, I've hit plenty of walls, I need to be ready to stand up and say, what could we do in this moment? So for us, even when I had the opportunity to come together with key people here at Comcast to say, all right, what do we want to do given everything? And it was interesting being in this moment in the midst of a global pandemic, right? Because even before the conversation became about race, and for many of us and for many corporate entities in particular, that, the murder of George Floyd, May 25th, certainly marked that moment. That COVID, in that period where we were all sort of facing COVID around the world for the first time, there was a much heightened level of awareness on just inequity, period. And some of the things that people had heard about in terms of technology advancing, how we do things, how we work, it seemed just outside of our reach. We knew it was coming. We didn't know how quickly. When you look back at history and you think about all the various evolutions and when things changed, it happens so much faster now than it did before. And in that moment, people recognize, like, wow, there are people who are still not connected. Yeah. There are small businesses that have a level of financial fragility that, I may not have witnessed as a customer, as a member of my community. And in one moment, that vulnerability, that being as close to paycheck, hearing that and seeing that is two different things. So there was already, I think, a foundation laid about the economic inequity, whether that was health disparities, on top of social disparities, and certainly from a technology perspective, since all of us, for the most part, that were using internet to get done what we needed to get done otherwise. So I think focusing it on and being, having the ability to work, among the largest broadband companies in the world, largest here in the U.S., and seeing and hearing from our customers about what they needed in that moment was really important. And it was a way that, we were able to unify internally. And then when it became about race, figuring out what we could do urgently was important. And I think many corporations will start with their philanthropic hat on in many ways to think about what can I do for communities. But this work, if we're going to get this right, if this truly is going to be transformative, companies need to have a different type of reflection internally. So it's not just about what you're doing for your communities, and not treating it like a crisis that's going to be one and done, like disaster relief funding. but really thinking about kind of that long-term strategy. Where can we weigh in? What does that look like for us from a digital equity perspective in terms of entrepreneurs and supporting small businesses? That's where I was quickly able to change my focus, that I shouldn't be structuring it like a relief plan. It was a long-term recovery plan.
Yeah, super strategic. I love that. One of the questions I also have for you, because you have to navigate such complexity, right? As you're thinking about kind of talent and advancement, and you mentioned that there's greater awareness, and absolutely there's some much greater awareness of kind of racial inequality. At the same time, while there's that awareness, I'm not so sure that the data suggests that people are ready to be anti-racist, right? Like this country. I know they're not the same, but even with greater awareness of, say, racism, people are not necessarily pining for affirmative kind of approaches. And so I guess how do you sort that, right? In your hiring, we see identification of opportunities to hire people. People come in entry level, but then don't advance. I mean, how are you dealing with some of those things?
I think this is a problem that's much larger than corporate America, and I do think a lot of times people will get focused in a very narrow way on entry-level pipeline programs. And the fact is that's been happening across corporate America for quite, a couple of decades now, and probably much more intensely in the past 10 years. But we know that just looking at C-suites today, that most companies can say, when you look at sort of the bottom half from a hierarchy perspective of their organization, they tend to meet some, if not all, of their diversity goals, but they're not really moving past that point, which really suggests that, in this moment, and this is sort of the conversation we've been having here, is how do we think about pacing? I mean, let's just take workforce diversity for a second. I was having this conversation recently. In terms of workforce diversity, it's about how fast are you hiring, how fast are you promoting, and ultimately what's your retention strategy? What's kind of the rate of exits, period. At the end of the day, it almost is not immediately connected to what your external social justice efforts might be. And I think that's a different frame for people. Sometimes people think, well, if I'm doing work in the community, it almost means I don't need to change my C-suite. And while people hear that and they think it sounds ridiculous, if you look across various, streams of private sector, large corporations, many times that's what you'll see. And I think some of the skepticism I hear when I'm talking to colleagues is, yeah, great, they'll do a couple of grants, work with a couple of civil rights organizations, have a couple of listening sessions, but that C-suite is not changing. And while I do think, like I said, there's been progress in terms of the record number of board appointments and C-suite level execs, the truth is we still haven't done the work to make sure that when we look at hiring, when we look at promotion, and hiring can be the easy part sometimes, it's really about do we have an inclusive culture? And that's not we're going to fix this in 3 months because we brought in a trainer that's going to talk about inclusive bias. That's really looking structurally at everything. One of the things a lot of people are talking about is removing some of the barriers, like the barrier of attaining a degree. Most people have grown up in the space that's the traditional pathway. The truth is most people in our country are not going down that traditional four-year college pathway. And so when we look at, economic prosperity, how do we think about that? We know there's one area of our company, we don't require degrees for all of our roles. There are about 30,000 employees in particular, technology operations roles, engineers. And for that population, most of them actually didn't receive their training through a traditional college degree path. And they've been able to advance from entry-level, mid-level careers into executive-level seats. Not all of that was by design, but we've been so encouraged by that. And how can we take some of that spirit, that energy, and also how we're assessing and identifying those skill sets and broaden it across the company. But there are some assumptions built into our workforce systems that we've all, been trained to use as signals to make the process easier, and those barriers are have many different, significant domino effect across the line. But I really do think you have to get focused and say, diversity strategy should be broad reaching across the company, but when it comes to workforce, we really need to be specific about hiring, promotion, retention, and building that culture. And that is an ongoing effort. And if you don't bring some momentum and pace to that, 10 years from now, we'll see, the only single digit increases in those levels, which is what we've seen for the past decade.
Well, Dalila, I could talk with you all day. We are out of time, and so I want to end on that note. Thanks so much for your leadership. We are so thrilled to be partnering with you, and really we'll look forward to kind of being in this fight together, and really appreciate your time today. Thanks so much for joining us at Horizons.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And, hopefully there was optimism there that everybody can tap into.
Thank you.